Greeting, excuse me. Greeting students, welcome to class. This week's lecture is, as you know here, it's a recorded lecture, and just wanted to, talk a little bit about quality control, quality assurance. We'll go over some of this even more next time we have a class together in forensic chemistry, or I'm sorry, forensic toxicology and controlled substances in the fall. But there are some interesting things we should probably describe for the context of this course. So we'll get into those with some lecture slides. For this week, I posted some reading material for you on the Canvas, and that will be to prepare us for next week's content. So if you haven't already, please make sure you check that out. Go ahead and give that chapter a read, and then we can kind of talk about it next week. Yeah, when we have our live session. So again, thank you so much for participating in last week's lecture or guest presentation, really. I'm excited to read your responses to my sort of uh, the reflection questions I've asked you about Danny Mata and her presentation. So really appreciate you all being showing up for that. Let's see. Let me go ahead and share the screen and we'll just get into today's lecture. All right. I believe we should have this. It's showing me that I'm sharing the screen, so I think we might be where we need to be. It's been a while since I've done one of these. So, all right. So we're going to talk about quality control, quality assurance, how important it is. You already know that it's important, but we're going to sort of reiterate some of the key points. Now, in the context of a drug chemistry laboratory, toxicology laboratory, you think about the life cycle of the sampling. Now, this would also apply to DNA in the biology section, but obviously I'm biased because I'm your toxicology professor. So we'll talk about, sample receipt, getting the sample, getting it entered, the accessioning, getting it entered into a computer system, into a LIMS system. Then, the sampling that we'll need to do from that once it's been logged into the system. Most samples in a toxicology lab are going to be ones that will need to do some sort of extraction or preparations. I'm so sorry. So an extraction prep stage is often necessary for biological samples. You don't squirt blood or vitreous or urine into the mass spectrometer. You will destroy the mass spectrometer. You do have to extract the drugs out of those samples. So there's a stage there. Most testing that we'll get into, and we'll discuss this in more detail next semester, we're always going to talk about screening steps, which are always going to be sort of, lower-ish cost, but high throughput screening, just to sort of help us figure out what we have. Then the sort of more labor intensive and often more expensive confirmation testing. And that'll give us our result. And from those results, we'll interpret those results and create a report. So that's kind of, the life cycle of samples going through a toxicology or drug chemistry laboratory. So in all these steps, there are certainly pitfalls that could occur. And, the importance for forensic science, the importance for the criminal justice system is that we have integrity in this chain, in this life cycle. We need to have that. Otherwise, bad things can happen. People can be wrongly convicted. People can be the customer, right, which is the people waiting on these results, can be affected. So let's get into quality assurance and quality control. So QA/QC, you've heard it before. Now, where does that come into this equation? Actually, everywhere, right? So quality control, blanks, sample, equipment checks, all these things. Peer review is required. Making sure other people are checking your work. That's a big deal. Training and proficiency, we've talked about that. And Danny kind of went over some of those things in the last week's class. And another big thing that Danny also does is the method validations and instrument validations. So you get a brand new instrument in the laboratory, you can't really do casework on it right away. You have to spend a lot of time making sure that instrument can perform as you say it can perform, and all that needs to be sort of documented and cataloged in the instrument validation. So that takes a lot of time and effort, and that's something that Danny loves to do. But that's a huge part before you can take that instrument into casework. So you got to do a lot of work ahead of time. And the quality control checks and calibration, troubleshooting, documentation, making sure you have policies and procedures for when things what happens. Danny brought up that really interesting story she had where she dropped a bunch of samples on the ground. What's the procedure there? Does everyone know what the procedure is? Is it just sweep it up, don't tell anybody, go back to work? Or make sure you let the chain of command know in the laboratory and make sure everything is documented of what occurred, what volumes were lost from those cases. And in doing so, you sort of cover your butt and make sure you're going to be okay if anything comes down the road, litigation, court. What happened to these samples? Defense attorney might, complain about that and request that the samples for their client are invalid. Well, if it's all well documented, it should be okay. So you got to have those policies and procedures in place to avoid any pain when it comes to those sorts of issues that can arise. All right, so quality assurance versus quality control. Now, what are we exactly saying here? So the Merriam-Webster definition for quality assurance is a program for the systemic monitoring and evaluation of various aspects of a project, service, or facility. Quality control is an aggregate of activities as design, as design, analysis, and inspection for defects designed to ensure adequate quality, especially in manufactured products. So those are sort of the dictionary's definitions. When we're talking about quality assurance and quality control in the laboratory, we're talking about quality assurance. We're talking about the program and the plan. So the policies, the practices that are in place to monitor and ensure the work is being done at the highest possible caliber. So in essence, what can we do to make sure this is done right? So you got to have the plan. That's quality assurance. And that differs a little bit from quality control, because quality control then is the tests and those checks that are executed to show that the system is working, to show that the instrumentation is validated and everything is performing properly. So in essence, was this done right is the quality control aspect. So the quality assurance goals, making sure things get done in a timely manner, for a medical examiner, you're going to be thinking about making sure your reports and the death certificates are all accurate and complete. Your reports for the medical examiner, or in a narco lab, your reports that are going to go into the case files, and making sure that mistakes and errors are minimized, and always sort of striving for improvement. So a lot of components for quality assurance. Some things we've talked about already, like training and proficiencies, the quality control aspects that we'll get into as well, policies, procedures, preventive and corrective action. So again, that's really sort of policy, in a way, right? Because if something does occur, well, then what are we going to do? What are you going to do to fix it if something happens? If the controls start not to work for a particular method, do you just forget about those controls and move on, or what's your corrective action for that method? And you can see, and from listening to Danny's presentation, how much work can go into these types of programs, and which is why, in fact, a lot of labs now actually hire a sole QA/QC person to over to oversee the laboratories, and that's a great resource because everyone having to work on some of these things can be very time consuming. So it's kind of nice to have a QA/QC manager. And if you're looking at the American Academy of Forensic Science job portal that we talked about earlier in a few weeks back, sometimes you'll actually see forensic science laboratory and wherever the job posting is for, and QA/QC manager. So they're looking for someone that knows the statistics, that knows how to do this sort of thing, and it can be an actual career, right, in itself. So it's kind of interesting to kind of think about that. Document control, continuous improvement, customer feedback, aspects of quality assurance. Okay, so documentation. Keep in mind, if it wasn't written down, then it didn't happen. And isn't that the truth in so many things in life? If it wasn't down on paper, then hey, did it really ever happen? So basically, the joke there is just that everything needs to be properly documented, and so paper trail can be your friend. So be really thorough and make sure you have that paper trail, just in case anything does happen where you need to go back and check to see where these things done. So a lot of places where the quality control is going to come in. So we got the quality assurance, we have the plan. What's that quality control? So quality assurance, quality control, QA/QC. Okay. Well, the quality control is going to be built into a lot of things. So the methodologies, the equipment, if the standards you're using are still working appropriately. So lots of validations and checks, control checks, looking for trends in your analysis. So for example, a lot of labs for a particular instrument will compile the sort of blanks and control data and put that into a spreadsheet, and sort of you can visualize that, you can plot it out, and keeping a running record of how the instrument's performing. If you start to see a dip in like the sensitivity of the instrument to a particular assay, then a good QA/QC program is going to sort of start detecting that. That's important, of course, because say your detector starts to stop working, you could artificially be getting less results, and it's really due to the instrumentation. But that could look like maybe you're getting less signal in your measurements, and so the quality control, the quality assurance and quality control program, hopefully will be kind of taking a look at that. And when the deviations start to occur, then you can correct them. Okay, peer review is really important. Technical review, administrative review. Basically, you really don't want to work in silos. They always talk about it. You don't want people just sort of doing all their own testing, and then no one taking a look at what their results are. And we've seen some cases we'll talk about that we've already talked about where some things like that have maybe occurred, and of course those have resulted in some pretty terrible circumstances. Okay. I apologize. I got a little tickle in my throat. So, okay. Training and proficiency. So training and proficiency, again, we've talked about that already, so we won't go in that too much detail, but obviously we need the training. It often requires those educational requirements that we've talked about already a couple times. And then the proficiency testing is something that is also useful. So making sure you can prove to another person that you do have the ability to perform those tasks. And so some of that can be in-house, some of that can be sort of external. can be like sort of external accreditation bodies that can come in and make sure you're doing things the right way. So policies and procedures. So here's a little comic. Nadine, I think you're taking Casual Fridays a bit too far. You should see me on Saturdays. So policies are the we will or we should. So you outline those goals, standards, and practices. Those are the policies. Procedures are how we will actually do those things. So step-by-step guides, more detail than the policy themselves. And deviations to procedure, should be documented and justified and explained if they occur. And sometimes they can be well justified, right? Danny actually mentioned this in her presentation. They have a method for ELISA that will often hit false positives. And going by the book for, validations and procedures, having that many false positives would be like a big no-no and could like invalidate the method. However, since it's documented that, especially for post-mortem samples, you can get a lot of molecules, especially in a body that's decomposing, that can actually look a lot like amphetamine, methamphetamine. So you will sometimes see false positives in those samples. And so that you can, document that and justify that is important and useful in the policies and procedures of the laboratory and its tests. So corrective action, corrective and preventative action, or CAPA. Corrective action, of course, is going to be reactive. So problems, mistakes happen. When they are discovered, they should be properly documented. That's sort of what we've talked about a little bit. So what has occurred? Was there a deviation from the procedure? And was that the root cause of the problem? And what needs to be done to prevent this from happening in the future? Now, preventative action is sort of proactive, right? We're gonna thwart these problems from arising in the first place by making sure we have scheduled instrumentation maintenance. That we have a cleaning schedule, making sure that the the sampler and the injection ports on the instrument are clean, so we have no crossover, no contaminants. Reviewing the control documents, so making sure that there isn't any sort of a drift in the systems over time. And analytical sort of like instrumentation drift is something we'll talk about more next semester, but you can't really know, you don't often know if you have these problems like drift and like the signal of the system, unless you're really doing a great job. Unless you're doing a really good job documenting your controls over time. So again, a lot of documentation. So document control, a nice prelude into that. So basically ensuring that everyone is on the same page, standardizing how things are done, that these documents are created and reviewed and edited appropriately. And so, what are these documents that we're talking about? Well, the SOPs. So if you haven't heard that term yet, you'll hear it, I'm sure, in the future. So SOP is standard operating procedures. So SOP is standard operating procedure. So the SOP for the lab will be one in which you'll have a book full of all the SOPs. There should be an SOP for everything. Here's the SOP for inputting samples into the computer system. Here's the SOP for sampling. Here's the SOP for doing the everything should have this documentation and policies and all these things should be controlled living documents, meaning that when the standard operating procedure is going to change for something, that there's a sort of footnote in the document that on this date, we have changed the standard operating procedure in the following way, and keep a track of that so that someone who does come into your lab can see what changes you've made over time to a particular method, to a particular policy procedure. It's really important to keep all that stuff documented. Okay, what about customer feedback? So my customer feedback, like a lot of people that works in medical examiner's office, is the decedent's family, right? People want to know what happened. You're getting these autopsies of individuals because something happened that an autopsy was required. And so what's happening there is that the family is waiting to find out via the medical examiner, via the work that you've done on the project, on the case, to determine the cause and manner of death. and that gets certified in the death certificate. So you always want the customer satisfaction to be great. And so it's a funny cartoon that says, so as you can see, customer satisfaction is up considerably since phasing out the complaint forms. And so customer feedback is a big deal. And I can tell you that, maybe I'm sure a factor that was pivotal in the demise of the toxicology laboratory that I used to work in Phoenix at the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office. That medical examiner's office is a large one, and it's still there. However, they are now sending their samples to a third-party private lab, and no longer is there an in-house toxicology lab, which is very sad. But one of the complaints for that laboratory was how long it took to get the medical examiner's death certificates for people that died. And one of the things that was preventing the medical examiners for giving that final cause and manner of death was waiting on the toxicology results. Toxicology is backed up for months. Sample's going to take you 60, 90 days, 90 plus days to get your samples analyzed. And that really affects the efficiency of a medical examiner's office. So those are your customers. It's those families waiting for those death certificates. Okay. So what are we going to do to fix this? Well, continuous improvement. It's the opposite approach of if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. We got to have eyes on what's happening in the laboratory. Are the policies and the procedures, are they working? What are some bottlenecks? I remember when I worked in the medical examiner's office in Phoenix, we had some huge bottlenecks, meaning we only had like 1 or 2 instruments doing the blood alcohol analysis. And you can imagine that's a huge sample, sort of bread and butter work of a toxicology lab is analyzing samples for blood alcohol, particularly for DUI investigation cases, right? So you have a bottleneck is when you have like so many samples, but they have to be ran only in like one instrument that happens to be working at the moment, when it's better to have maybe 2 or 3 of those instruments working. So those are, and there's many other examples of bottlenecks that can occur, but they have to be identified. And so making sure, you do have a good approach to quality assurance, quality control, you should hopefully find those things. So why do we need quality assurance? Well, of course, to make sure that our work is on the up and up, the work is, excuse me, a direct reflection on the laboratory, give customers confidence in the work. Okay. Oh, Annie Dukin. So, boy, you'll always hear about Annie Dukin forever because of the epic things that she admitted to, falsifying, dry labbing, all those things. She did get sentenced to some prison time, but mostly probation there, and did plead guilty to those things that she said, that those things that she did. So the Annie Dukin, how did this happen, right? Like, how did this happen? And you could put a square amount of blame on that Massachusetts laboratory system in it by itself, right? Like this, some of the things that occurred with that case are just so inexcusable. Um, the consequences of Annie Dukin's actions, uh, it's they didn't have a great quality assurance, quality control system, really, if you think about it. Like, how could it be, right? And there's, a big deal, like, false imprisonment for some individuals. So samples getting pinned on individuals that were, improperly collected or analyzed or sampled. Um, so a lot of ramifications for this sort of deviant behavior by this analyst. I'm so sorry for the coughing, guys. And of course, I didn't bring any water to where I'm at. So, and a huge sort of cost to taxpayers as well. So you're really messing up a lot when these things occur. So, really, Annie Dukin should never have happened, and hopefully never happens again. A proper quality assurance program, performance reviews. A good performance review by a QA officer, QA/QC officer, they would have addressed her testing rate. So a QA/QC system in the laboratory, they're going to run numbers on you. They're going to like, hey, Mr. Vargas is analyzing this many samples, and we're going to actually like make sure that that person really is doing that many samples. So good policies and procedures in place in the laboratory would actually track that. So a good performance review should have addressed those testing rates and the claims, because Annie Dukin was claiming to have this super efficient turnover of samples, but she wasn't, by some accounts was never actually not in the lab that often. So it didn't really make sense, right? Also requiring documentation for testing and technical administrative review could have prevented the dry labbing and the mislabeling of samples. And one of the other big things that Annie did was sort of lie about what her academic credentials were. This is such a big deal. Like, unless she completely falsified her official transcripts, I think that's probably difficult to do. If you say you have a master's from somewhere, well, that employer should ask for those official transcripts to confirm that yes, in fact, you are who you say you are. You have the education you say you have, right? So a lot of things went wrong there. Anyway, kind of wrapping up here. I think I only have a few more slides, but basically, a good QA/QC system should in theory prevent a lot of the sort of deviant, when our superstars of deviant forensic science behavior that I mentioned before. And this slide here just sort of summarizes some of those life cycles of a sample. We talked about that at the beginning of this lecture, but the sample receipt, right? Chain of custody on that. Are they properly labeled? Are they sealed properly? Sampling, chain of custody again, making sure the balance is verified. So if you're going to do sampling of that piece of evidence, typically you're going to weigh that. You're going to weigh out how much you took from the original amount of drug or the original amount of sample, and you're going to want to make sure that your scale is properly balanced, right? During your extraction, are the pipettes that you use calibrated, right? Are the reagents that you're using expired or not? So these are all sort of parts of this big puzzle that we're trying to talk about here. Lots of things to sort of make sure you're being documented and maintained. And as the life cycle of the sample goes through the screening and confirmation testing, like making sure the controls are proper, the instrument parameters are working, and with the results, making sure that the controls worked. I mean, you'll get results no matter what, but if you look at your controls and they're all off, how can you be certain that your actual sample result is legitimate? So that's why it's so important to make sure you're looking at your controls, looking at your blanks, If you have signal in the blank and you're not supposed to, that's a problem. So you got to make sure that the controls work, the blanks work. You have to go in there and make sure. And a good, a good, a really good practice then, of course, there is the peer review process, and so making sure another analyst is also checking your work. It almost thinks that you almost think that that sort of didn't happen in that Massachusetts lab. So yeah, make sure everyone's trained, proficient, and following the correct procedures, right? I mean, that's the name of the game. That's what we're talking about. So remember, the quality assurance is the what we do to make sure we do things right. The QC part is the actual tests and things that we're going to actually do to make sure we're doing things right. And it should be built into everything that you do in the laboratories. And again, I'm talking mostly about a medical examiner setting because that's what I'm most familiar with. But any any sort of section you get into, all of these same things sort of apply. And we already talked about accreditation, and all these things will need to be done to make sure you can get the accreditation for your laboratory. So, and we talked, and then Danny talked about the accreditation pieces last time, which is kind of nice as well. So that is all I had for you. I hope you enjoyed it. I super apologize for my coughing on this one. It's kind of too late. I'm not going to go back and record it again. So hopefully it was okay. I apologize for that. Hope you're all doing well. So very looking forward to meeting you all in person sometime soon. So thanks so much for watching this. I'm going to turn it off now, upload this maybe tonight, and just make sure you for this week check the reading for this week, and if there's any other assignments, I'll pop them up on Canvas, and I will send you a message to alert you if they're there. Okay, thank you so much.